now I will give the floor to Karianne Johansen and Jean-Daniel Lelièvre, and they will present the work they've done focused on vaccine research and development, prioritization and funding at a Europe scale.
Thank you. So I will present the work we have done with the Karianne from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health and myself and other at INSERM regarding the vaccine research and development. So the objective of the European Joint Action of Vaccination is to find the ways to increase vaccine coverage, and therefore defining research questions that aim to reach this goal is a key question. As liked by many speakers before me, we can find easily a great diversity of questions regarding this topic on increased vaccine coverage. Therefore, in a context of limited resources, prioritizing research questions becomes a necessity. Finally, the research funding system in Europe is still very complex, involves many actors, and is fragmented. The objective of the first part of this work package was to implement a process leading to evidence-based and transparent definition of research priorities in Europe in the field of vaccination research. This selection process must be carried out rigorously in accordance with best practices. And it's important to remind that this process focuses mainly on public health research aiming at improving vaccine coverage, and not on classical RD aiming at developing, for instance, novel vaccines such as mRNA vaccine, for instance. Therefore, many of the subjects to be prioritized will therefore most likely concern epidemiology, human and social sciences, as well as implementation research. It's important also to define how to fund these research questions. So it was mandatory to define how to better understand different organization priorities and European member states' use of financing mechanisms and vaccination research, to review on joint and collaborating European funding mechanisms, and finally to understand opinions on mechanisms to find and collaborate on shared fundings for common priorities on research in vaccination. So the first topic of the first part of this work package focused on prioritization framework. We have developed a framework based on an MCDA inspired from the Child Health and Nutrition Research Initiative by Rudens and collaborators. The general principle of this kind of framework is that each research proposition is assessed through a series of several steps. The first one was to select the managing team, to define the scopes of the process, and to find experts for the next step. Then we define research question. This research question was either a question which correspond to a 3 to 5 years possible programs, or more specific question on a specific theme. For the collation of these questions, we perform a broad-based consultation and a direct solicitation of relevant experts, and we consolidate at the end a final list of research questions to be prioritized. The next step was the definition of different criteria related to these research question. We propose a first list based on the analysis of the literature of 8 different criteria, for instance, acceptability, equity, and so on. And we have a first list of experts to be able to consolidate this list of choice of criteria. Then we use another group of experts to weight these criteria, and it was done once again through a video conference with the expert. And the final step was the scoring of the research question. And I will show you the two different exercises we perform. At the end, we have a final list of questions. We weight this question using the different criteria, and we apply a score from 0 to 3. The bad one is 0, and 3 it's the good, the best one. And we submitted all the results to all the panelists, and at the end we have either a virtual or a face-to-face meeting to reach a consensus and to have a list of prioritized questions. We have published this methodology in an article published in Vaccine last year. So I will present you briefly the first exercise was based on the initial list of 4 different vaccine: influenza, measles containing vaccine, HPV, and pertussis. And we decide to use this kind of vaccine because they could be applied at different age of life in children, adolescents, and elderly. We were able to collect 1,024 research questions at the beginning. Some of them were not relevant, or there are some duplicates. So at the end, we have 27 research questions. We make the final prioritization, and you can see here the 6 top questions that arise from this the prioritization, and for most of them, they are directly related to the 4 pilot vaccine, to measles, HPV, pertussis, or influenza. But you have one question, it's more a general question, and it's quite interesting because we have already spoken about this topic. It's the involvement of other healthcare professionals in the vaccination, here the pharmacist. So due to the COVID-19, we obviously change a little the way we aim to make our second exercise, and we focus mainly on COVID-19 vaccine. Unfortunately, for this exercise, we are only able to have 35 questions, which is far lower than the previous exercise. 8 were general question on vaccination, and the other were mainly focused on COVID-19. You can see here the 6 top question of this second exercise, and some of them are directly related to the COVID-19 for the second, the third, and the 5th one, and the last one, and the other are more general questions. So at the end, we found that this kind of prioritization was quite efficient and relevant, but we are able to draw some lessons and to make some recommendations for next exercise. The first one is to ensure that the diversity of expertise in the pool of experts are present, and associate as far as possible an external observer to ensure transparency, which was the case for us. The second recommendation, the scope should be present and explained as often as necessary in order to avoid submission of out-scope research questions, that it was the case at least for the first exercise, and to support an objective and appropriate assessment from expert. The third recommendation, and it's quite important because, as you can see, we have very few questions for the second exercise, is to, as much as possible, use every occasion you have, such as live events, conferences, and so on, to ensure good understanding of the scope and to be able to collect a great number of questions. That's a key point of this kind of methodology. Then, regarding the more technical aspect of this methodology, regarding the choice of criteria or the weight of criteria, it's quite important that there is no a misunderstanding or unambiguous and understandable way to define these criteria and to choice and to weight these criteria. And finally, for the final ranking, we thought that this meeting need to be rigorously led to ensure that all experts express their opinion when necessary and all research questions should be discussed. So I'll stop here, and I would like to thank all the members that have been involved in this part of the work package, and namely Florence, Francis, and Marie-Paul Kenny, and I will leave the floor to Karen.
Thank you. And then the second part, you can hear me now? Yeah, that's good. The second part of this work package is focused on financing. So when you have prioritized the research questions, you also need to look into how could you fund them. And we wanted to look into the European landscape of funding in vaccine research and development, but also on vaccination research. And we had three areas we looked into. We looked into national research organization, which naturally fund these areas. And we also looked into multilateral organizations, which we know were active in the area of vaccination research. And finally, we also follow the massive funding which took place on the COVID-19 vaccines. So first, when we did, back in 2019, we did a survey towards a national research organization. So of course, they did not fund COVID-19 vaccines back then, but they were really funding research and development in the early stage. It was general research and development of vaccines. It was basic research and preclinical development. And some of them finance research on influenza, pandemic influenza, and HPV, which John Daniel talked about, but very few of them supported any research on measles, mumps, or rubella, the older vaccines. And then some wanted to prioritize European funding on vaccines for emerging infectious diseases, vaccines to be used during epidemic outbreaks, and it was before COVID-19. We also asked them if they cooperated, what kind of cooperation mechanisms did they use, and what was needed to be in place to increase cooperation. And most frequently, they do joint calls, but also some bilateral and multilateral cooperation with other countries. But if they wanted to increase the cooperation in funding, they said that there was a need for clear guidance and options for collaborations, and it should really be built into the governance system. And there also had to be a joint evaluation and selection process in place prior to the announcement of a call. And there also had to be sufficient lead time to approve and agree on topics for calls for proposals and alignment on financial rules. And we asked them if they wanted to think about the potential future joint European mechanisms like JPI, if that could increase collaborative efforts in vaccine R&D, but only less than half of the organizations believed in such a tool for joint funding. They thought that voluntary mechanisms could be more suitable. But one area most of them actually mentioned as particular need for collaboration within the vaccine field was late-stage clinical trials and phase 3, phase 4 trials. And this was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, we started also to follow multilateral organizations, and they are, as we all are aware of, very active in financing vaccine R&D. And I think we have one of them for the panel debate. And there are in the different stage of the cycle, some are very early and some are very late, more on financing vaccine stocks. But one interesting finding we had from all of these multilateral organizations was that very few of them actually receive money from the Ministry of Health or from the research organization, but a lot of countries use official development assistance, ODA, to finance this purpose. And we, of course, wanted to look into the joint action strategies, the vaccine hesitancy, stockouts, supply immunization systems, surveillance systems, and very few of these actually tasks are financed today, which we could discuss in the panel. And then we followed the COVID-19 vaccines, and we asked the question if this will be a paradigm for joint funding and new EU instruments. And of course, R&D funding for COVID-19 vaccines has been really at an unprecedented speed, and a huge and massive vaccine candidate development, a huge portfolio of vaccine, which was needed in this tragic pandemic we have been through. So we have, for Europe, we had a portfolio of vaccines which we could choose from, and we could also change according to the safety signals and what we saw with the portfolio. But we also then saw direct investment to public-private partnership organizations, and also really new instruments like the advanced purchase agreements, and also investing directly into pharmaceutical company and manufacturing, which we really didn't cover back then in our survey. And now in the future, we will also follow the implementation of the HERA, and they actually say that they will ensure development on procurement and key medical countermeasures, where also vaccines will be one of their topics, but on emerging pathogens. So our recommendations or take back home message from this work package is that as we see the landscape today, is really a great diversity of possible topics, and there is limited resources. And then as Jean-Daniel pointed out, that prioritizing research questions becomes really needed. And we think that more research on real-world effectiveness on vaccines, implementation of new vaccines in national public health programs, but also follow-up on long-term safety and safety signals when you introduce new vaccines should be a prioritized area for funding. And the establishment of the HERA is key to ensure better vaccine preparedness in Europe, but it should not be at the expense of other important priority initiatives. So that is maybe one of the key messages we have today. And the work package 7, they have developed an effective methodology for prioritizing research questions, which we could use in the future to classify what areas should be prioritized and align on them. But then the success and impact of such a selection depends on the possibility of funding the research questions raised. And since still the research funding system in Europe is rather complex, is different Ministry of Health and money involved, it's still very fragmented. So we really think that in the future, if you want to have joint mechanisms for funding, more alignment, you should really work on that for the future. Thank you.